Hello and welcome to And Did Those Feet, the podcast that explores the world of post-war English football. And joining me as ever, hello, Karl Hemsley.
Hello, Peter.
Karl, we're going to discuss some of the top players in English football during the 1950s by looking at who won the Footballer of the Year from its inception in 1948 through to the maximum wage abolition in 1960. So it's the top players of the 50s. What kind of players are we going to be discussing? Let's name a few names here.
Well, there's quite a variety, isn't there? There's a variety of positions. There's a variety of a bit of variety, even of nationality. Some players whose names are very familiar, and some who may be not quite so well remembered these days. So it's a real rich mix of football from that era, including, like Matthews, Finney, and Lofthouse players that would definitely be very familiar, but some who we're going to come to who seem slightly more surprising choices and less familiar names.
I thought it was interesting how a lot of particularly in the first sort of half of the decade, a lot of the players who win the award are what you might call the kind of aristocracy of the 1950s football. Stanley Matthews, Joe Mercer, these are famous names, Billy Wright, Nat Lofthouse, Tom Finney. Whereas especially the later you get into it's as if the football writers are making this award get a bit more radical and imaginative in the choices they make. So you end up with people like Bert Troutman, which is a great choice, surely. But also people like Sid Owen, for example, or Bill Slater, not really well-known names at all. So it's an interesting picture of football in the 1950s. We start with Stanley Matthews, who, of course, belongs, like a lot of these early award winners, to the 1930s, or at least he begins his career in the 1930s. And he's quite distinguished in the 1930s. He plays, fairly commonly for England. He plays in some major games for England, like the Battle of Highbury in 1934, and the disgraceful game in Berlin, where the England players were deceived into giving the Nazis salute.
Yes.
But really, by the time we get to 1946, let's say 46, because it's actually the first proper season of the league begins in August 1946 with what Tom Finney describes as a carnival atmosphere. By the time we get to 1946, Stanley Matthews is 31, and you might think that his career is, now just sort of winding it down. On the contrary, it's about to begin. And really, the highlights for Matthews over the next, actually 20 years he's got left, are quite extraordinary. From the Matthews final in 1953, all those caps he gets for England, during the 50s, right through to his triumphant retirement in 1965. He really has an incredibly distinguished career. How do we remember him now, do you think?
I think he definitely still is remembered, probably more than any other player in the immediate post-war years. Finney, I think, would be the only one to compare in the memory. He's certainly remembered because of his remarkable longevity of being able to play at such an advanced age. So, as you say, he was already, he's already into his 30s when he won the award for the first time. But then, not only that, he then was the first winner of the Ballon d'Or in the 1950s and won Football of the Year again in the 1960s.
Curious thing about Matthews is that I would say he couldn't tackle. He couldn't really head the ball. In fact, he didn't tackle, let's be honest. He couldn't really head the ball. He didn't have much of a left foot. A reasonable left foot, but not much of a... What he did have was two things, I would say. He had remarkable speed off the mark, in that speed that you need over 2 or 3 yards in football. And he also had a sublime ability to cross the ball onto the head of the player he's looking for. And those two skills, if you look at the Matthews Cup final, so-called 1953, when at last, because the nation takes him to their heart and they want him to win the FA Cup. this is the big deal. And in 53, he finally makes it because he plonks the ball on the head of Stan Mortensen several times and Bill Perry, so that they score the goals. And considering that I often wonder with Matthews, would he survive in the modern game? I don't know.
It is a good question. I think there are two ways of being a great footballer. One is to be very one is to be exceptionally good at something. Beating your man and getting a crossing, which Stanley Matthews was, being an example. And other players are great players because there's no real hole in the game at all. They can do a bit of everything. And Matthews is definitely an example of the master of one aspect of the game, but he mastered it to such a degree that it undoubtedly made him a great player.
Oh, I think that's very succinct. He had one great skill, and it was enough to see him through. Whether he'd managed in the modern game, I mean, bear in mind he had an antipathy to coaching, and was really at daggers drawn a lot of the time with the England head coach Walter Winterbottom, and whether he'd have got away with that.
I think he was an intelligent man, and maybe he wouldn't have had an antipathy to coaching if he was experiencing the sort of coaching that players get today.
Well, you might be right there. Yes, that makes sense.
I think he'd have a respect for the likes of Guardiola, Ancelotti, etc.
Yes, you might well be right. Matthews, famously a winger. The next winner of the award, 1949, Johnny Carey, was a fullback. What do we know about Johnny Carey? Is he remembered so much these days? I think perhaps not.
I don't think he is, but I do think he really does belong in the top echelon. So he started playing before the war. He came from Dublin, played for Manchester United, was a very versatile player, but before the war, mainly an attacker. But post-war, Matt Busby made him both the the United captain, and started playing him as a right back. I think it's fair to say an unusually attacking right back for the day. He's got several achievements that stand out. The first non-British player to captain a side to the FA Cup, and the first to captain a side to the First Division title. He was the captain of the first non-British side, sort of, to beat England in England, because Ireland beat England.
That's right. This is an ambiguous or rather difficult
you're right.
field, isn't it? Because the feeling is that they were kind of British in all sorts of ways, but politically, of course, the Republic of Ireland wasn't British. There was one curious thing about Johnny Carey, was that he seemed to play for both the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. In fact, on one occasion, he seems to have played for them both in the same week.
I think what that is it might be, we refer to it as Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland, but I don't think they did in footballing terms at that time. There were two Irish football federations on the island of Ireland, one based in Dublin and one in Belfast, but they both laid claim to representing the whole of Ireland, which sounds as though it would be incredibly antagonistic, but I don't think it was.
It doesn't seem to have been.
Quite a common thing for people to play for both. And it was only after Carey's time that it switched to being the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland.
And quite separate. You're right about all those firsts. I think he's the first Irishman to captain Manchester United as well. And as you say, the first to win both league and cup. Tremendous achievements. 48, he wins the cup. 51-2, he wins the league. So, yeah, I mean, an elite and an elite player in quite clearly.
The player that was chosen to captain the rest of Europe against.
Indeed, yes.
Against England.
I mean, he's clearly somebody that very different from Matthews in that sense, because you know, Matthews in a way was his own man. He was a maverick. He was an individualist. You get the feeling with Carey that he was the kind of player who could take responsibility for the whole team on the pitch, and not dissimilar perhaps to the 1950 winner, which, as we move on now to Joe Mercer. You'll remember Joe Mercer as I do from when you were a youngster, and Manchester United were cock of the dung heap in Manchester, with noisy neighbours, one might say. And Joe Mercer was their manager, and of course Joe Mercer took that Manchester City side in the late 1960s. Bell, Summerby, Lee, that distinguished team. He took them to the league title. He took them to the FA Cup. And he took them to the European Cup Winners' Cup. And all that strikes me as interesting because he won so many titles as a player. And I wonder actually if any manager has won. Let's look at the titles he won. He played for Everton in the 1930s. and won the league in 38-39. So the last league season before the war began, and took 7 years out of his career. He won the league in a distinguished Everton side containing players like Tommy Lawton, top draw players, Dixie Dean, top draw footballers. And then after the war, he moves to London, he moves to Arsenal, and he wins a whole lot of more pots. He wins another league title in 1948. He wins the cup again in 1950. He wins the league yet again in 53. So he's one of the most those unusual players who wins the league for two clubs. Very unusual to see that. I was trying to think of some parallels. There was a player called Richardson who played for Everton and Arsenal in the 80s, who won the league with two clubs.
There are a few examples, but not many. Ray Kennedy did it for Arsenal and Liverpool.
Yes, he did. That's right. Mercer, but Mercer then embellishes it by winning. He wins the league with the two different clubs. He wins the cup with Arsenal. I don't think he won it with Everton actually, but he wins both league. He wins the league with not only with two clubs, but also as a player and a manager, and he wins the cup as a player and a manager. And I wonder if anyone else has done that, has won both major trophies in both major roles. I suspect not. And of course, it was briefly.
You'd have to come forward a long time, and I think go to Dalglish.
Dalglish. Yeah, you're almost certainly right about that. Of course, yes. Yeah, good shout. And of course, and as I said, he was the first post Ramsey England manager, briefly but successfully. And I mean, I take from Joe Mercer's career, has anybody really won as many different pots in football's showpiece occasions as Joe Mercer? And his career altogether was extraordinary. Another player basically whose career was ruined by the war, as was Harry Johnson, who wins in 1951.
Yes. So Harry Johnson, maybe of the players so far, not quite as stellar as the first few that we've talked about, but he was the centre half and captain of Blackpool in their great era. So he appeared in, I think it was 3 FA Cup finals. He was the guy that was captain in the famous cup final in '53. And also won 10 caps for England. So it was certainly a distinguished career. Probably his two most famous games were in the same year, which were the cup final in '53 that we've just mentioned, the famous Matthews Cup final, so called. And of course, later that year, he was one of those players that played at Wembley when infamously England were thrashed by Hungary.
Yes, he was one of the players who was embarrassed, and perhaps the most embarrassed of all the England players on duty that day. 6 of them never played again for England. Johnson was one of those, but he was really bamboozled by Hidegkuti, the Hungarian centre forward, and I think perhaps never quite lived it down. Sorry, I interrupted.
No, that's fine. You're absolutely right. I mean, how much of that was the fault of Johnson himself, and how much the tactics or non-tactics from his manager is maybe a moot point.
It is indeed.
But Johnson, he certainly had an excellent club career, and was captain of Blackpool through what was by far the best period of their history.
We were wondering what exactly triggered his award in 1951, which is when he wins it. I've got two answers to that. One is that the award was made on the eve of the cup final, and in 1951 he was captaining Blackpool, and Blackpool were indeed in the cup final. They didn't win it, of course, but then they wouldn't have known that before the award was made. And the second thing is he scores 7 goals in that season, and in that respect, he reminds me a little bit of John Terry, who you may remember from years gone by. He was kind of good for sort of half a dozen goals a season, and evidently Harry Johnson could do the same. Another player who appeared in the Hungarian debacle was, by the way, I should say about Harry Johnson, he then subsequently went on to manage Reading in the 3rd Division South. And I wonder whether he may have come up against a certain former teammate of his, who by this stage was managing Ipswich Town. And I wonder who would have won those games. But I think he might well have run into Alf Ramsey on the touchline in the 3rd Division in the late 1950s.
Yeah.
On to 52, Billy Wright wins it. And Billy Wright is also, of course, a veteran of the 1953 embarrassment against the Hungarians, but he's got so many more strings to his bow than that. It seems to me that one of the things about Billy Wright, first of all, let's just make it clear: 105 caps, first player ever to win 100 international caps, 90 caps as captain. He's practically appointed captain as soon as he's in the team. All right, 25 caps in, but he is among senior players. He doesn't really have any career before the war, so he's the first winner really of the award who hasn't played before the Second World War, whose career was not interrupted by 7 years of conflict. And his career is just absolutely stellar. He's a one club man, as some but not all of these players are. We've been talking about Johnny Carey is a one club man. Harry Johnson is. Billy Wright is. He plays only for Wolves or to all intents and purposes, and for England. And when you bear in mind that he was also captain in 3 World Cup campaigns, 50, 54, and 58.
Yeah.
Well, he was obviously an extraordinary player. It's quite hard for us, I think, Karl, to get a handle on Billy Wright. He seems to be. I mean, first of all, he's a wing half. Let's call him a defensive midfielder initially, and who transfers to centre half in the 54 World Cup. I think it is. I think it's after all those disastrous games where England concedes 7 away to Hungary, 6 at home to Hungary, 4 in a 4-4 draw against Belgium in the 54 World Cup. And there's just nobody who can seem to stop the bleeding until Billy Wright goes back to set up. But the reason why it's difficult to really understand what his qualities were, I think, is that he was quite short. He was actually about 5'8", I think, and not really. I mean, he wasn't physically imposing in the way we would think of as appropriate to a centre half. But there we are. He
must have been very robust, because you mentioned a couple of his records. Another of them, which I believe still holds, is he played 70 consecutive games for England.
Isn't that incredible?
Which really is amazing. So he was clearly a robust, if not a huge one for a centre half.
1953 is Nat Lofthouse, and tell why does Nat Lofthouse's name live on, Karl? What did he?
Well, because of being a hero both for his club Bolton and for England. His nickname, famously, of course, was the Lion of Vienna, where he helped England to win in Austria, which was a genuine achievement back in the early 50s.
It was,
and
huge.
He took a pretty awful injury for his efforts in getting his head to a ball, and was adored by the Bolton fans as well. Prolific scorer, so 30 goals in 33 caps. And albeit we've just been talking about Billy Wright, who won just more than 3 times that number, 33 caps in those days actually was a lot. And he scored at very nearly a goal a game. He, again, presumably part of the reason why he would have been Player of the Year this year is Bolton had got to the cup final. But as with Johnson in 51, he ended up on the losing side. And then as a Manchester United fan, of course, I've got to show some forgiveness to Lofthouse, because in 1958, he played his part in Bolton beating Manchester United in the final. And one of the goals was a very controversial one when he barged into the United keeper, the sort of goal that wouldn't be allowed today.
The sort of goal that would bring a red card from the referee. Yes. He afterwards agreed that it was a foul. Although I think I'm right in saying that was the rules of the game in those days allowed, if the goalkeeper had the ball. It seems extraordinary to say. I think this was changed in 1960. I may be wrong about that. I think if the goalkeeper had the ball, it was legitimate to barge him, which seems extraordinary, doesn't it? But
completely different age. But I mean, Lofthouse certainly is one of the people that's remembered. I mean, especially in Bolton. I think
especially in Bolton, he's a one club man.
Just how much respect there is for him in that
indeed, and affection. I said he was a one club man. I almost called him a one man club, and that's not that much of an exaggeration either, because he did everything at Bolton Wanderers, from manager to president to the rest of it in the bottom. One thing that strikes me about Nat Lofthouse as a footballer of the year is that in the 1950s, the English centre forward was a revered position, and there were some great centre forwards in that period, not just Lofthouse, but also Stan Mortensen, as we mentioned, Jackie Milburn, of Newcastle United, uncle of Bobby and Jackie Charlton, of course, famously. These were great inspirational centre forwards. Curious, really, that Lofthouse is the only centre forward who wins Footballer of the Year. You might think you might have thought that it's such a glory position, number 9. You might have thought that a good half of these awards went to, but not at all. Not at all.
That's a good point.
On to 54, and Tom Finney, who wins the award in 54 and in 57. And we've been talking a little bit about one club men, and we can stay on that subject with Tom Finney, because he played for Preston, and he was known as the Preston plumber because he had a plumbing business, incredible to narrate. But what strikes me most about Tom Finney, apart from the fact that he only ever played for Preston, 14 seasons for them, 12 in the first division, finishing second twice. He never won anything actually with Bolton, did he? He never won a cup. He never won the league, but he did win a lot. He won a lot.
This is another example of him of a player getting to the cup final, but being on the losing side.
It is. I know. Actually, there's a bit of a curse that attaches to the Footballer of the Year award, I noticed. It'll be interesting to do the maths on that. Of course, he fought in the war. A lot of these players fought in the war. He fought in the war. He was in the 8th Army as a tank driver. And, these guys had quite a heroic backstory. They weren't just coming through the academy. But of course, he was also, one thing I think about Tom Finney is, if all the players that we've discussed so far, if I was going to put any one of them I don't know if you agree with me, into the modern era, I think I would take Tom Finney, because he fits so perfectly into a 4-3-3. He's a goal scorer. He's a goal maker. He can play across the front line. He can play in any position. When you play him at centre forward, he'll get goals. If you play him on the wing, he'll make goals. He got 30 goals in 76 England caps. And, that's a pretty decent record for someone who, we don't have a record for his assists, of course, but for a winger, which is what he was, first and foremost.
I wonder if the player in modern football who most resembles Finney in terms of his pure footballing qualities, albeit as a personality completely different, would be Cristiano Ronaldo.
Oh, very good. Yeah, right. I was wondering.
Two-footed, very powerful shot, can beat a man. Ronaldo, of course, big fella in a way that Finney wasn't, but both were extremely good in the air. Both brave. Admittedly, Ronaldo might roll around a bit, but he still comes back for more. Whereas Finney he must have been as tough as nails. He would have taken all types of stick from defenders. That point about him being able to play if any of these players could have played in the modern game, Finney the best chance. I think I'd agree with that. And just one small thing about him winning the Football of the Year in that year, which says something about English football, is he was a second division player that season, wasn't he?
Oh, amazing. Yeah, amazing. Incredible.
Which, that just wouldn't happen with an equivalent award today. No. And I think it's an illustration of the gap between the divisions in those days just wasn't what it is today.
No, absolutely right. And bear in mind that players routinely played for England from the second division. You could someone like Eckersley or Gilmerick, Eckersley of Blackburn and Gilmerick of Birmingham, routinely pitched up in the team, in the England team from second division matches, actually ended up playing, as I think we said earlier, that you could end up playing against somebody like Bury on the Saturday, and on Wednesday you're up against Frank Puskas and Hungary, and you got to make the best of the contrast and do your best with it. 1955 is Don Revie. Don Revie is a really odd. There's a bit of football history here, isn't there? Because we got to factor in that what happened in the game against Hungary. So what's the background here?
Well, Revie was again another example of Footballer of the Year, then losing the cup final, helping his team to the final and then losing. But famously, City were employing the Revie plan, which meant that he was playing as this withdrawn number 9. So a number 9 on his back, but not really a centre forward. a deep line centre forward like Hidekute, who'd played such a big part in destroying England with Hungary, is that Manchester City decided, well, if the Hungarians can make it work so well, let's have a crack at it ourselves.
And Revie was the, what should we say, the inspirational genius behind you. When you look at the games from the mid-50s, which Revie takes part in, this sort of characteristic image of him, for me, is of him accelerating out of the centre circle, spreading the ball out to the wing and moving towards the D to pick it up again. That's not really what centre forwards did in England in the 1950s,
right.
but it is what Revie did. And it was, for a time, extremely successful, bringing the FA Cup in 1956 to Manchester City. And that was quite... Of course, Revie was more famous, if anything, for his managerial skills. When we look at, he won so many pots with Leeds. I think Leeds were the best team in the country between 65 and 75. And that was really his doing. He took over as manager there when they were at the bottom of the second division. And within 5 years, they'd won the league title. I mean, it's not Sir Alf Ramsey, but it's pretty near it.
Mm. Yeah, his record at Leeds was unbelievable. Because, of course, apart from the things he won, famously the number of times that Leeds would be second in competitions as well. Unbelievably consistent. 5
times runners up in the first division.
Oh.
I mean, they were always in the mix. That's one thing. If you beat Leeds, you probably win the title.
Yes, that's right.
56 brings us Bert Trautmann, an extraordinary story. Fought for the Germans in the Second World War, fought as a paratrooper on the Eastern Front. He was in Ukraine. He witnessed all the reverses. He's captured then as a prisoner of war. He's brought to England. He's released after 3 years captivity. And at this time, he's playing in goal. He'd never played in goal before he came to England. He's playing in goal for a local non-league side in the northwest of England. And Manchester City take a look at him. They like the look of him. They pick him up. He goes into their team. And gradually, he becomes one of the most celebrated. I mean, at first, there's a hell of a hoo-ha about it because Manchester has a large Jewish community. Liberal England is offended by the thought of what he may have got up to in Russia in the Second World War. And actually, I think it's quite a credit to the English of the late 50s, let's say, that they accept him. And actually, he becomes, he's Footballer of the Year in 56. So it's more than just acceptance. They lionize him. They come to revere him. And part of the reason why they come to revere him is because of his heroics in the 56 Cup final, when he breaks his neck and plays on and makes further saves. I mean, incredible story, really. But a remarkable narrative all round. And he ends up as really a sort of, one of the central figures of sort of Anglo-German friendship in footballing terms for the next few years. Well, we're just coming towards the end now. So with Danny Blanchflower winning in 58 and Sid Owen in 59, that brings us up to 1960. And perhaps we've just got time to talk through a little bit about Danny Blanchflower and Sid Owen. So should we bring to, so we could, why do we think so highly of Danny Blanchflower? This sort of 50 years on.
Yeah, he seems to me to be the sort of player who could make a side tick, dictate the tempo of a team. Wonderful passer of the ball, and he did that both for Northern Ireland and for Spurs. I mean, it's quite remarkable when you think of Northern Ireland's record in the 1958 World Cup, getting to the quarter-final. A World Cup when all 4 British sides were there, and Blanchflower was very much the leader of that side, as he was for the Spurs side as well. He had this great idea that football wasn't all about winning; it was about glory. It was entertaining people. It was playing the right type of football, and certainly the Spurs side that he was in lived up to that ideal and then some.
They won a few trophies too. Let's be fair.
Oh yes, it wasn't against winning, that's for sure. He did his fair share of that.
It's curious to me that he wins this pot in 58 when his own glory years are 60, 61 when Spurs do the double. Spurs become the first team in the 20th century to to win both the league and the cup. They go on to win the FA Cup in the next year and the European Cup Winners' Cup in 63. And of course, 63, that is the first time that an English team wins in Europe. And so that's quite a significant moment. Danny Blanchflower but that's all 5 years on from his taking this award in 58. Sorry, I've interrupted you.
No. I was just saying he did win it in 61 as well.
Ah, true.
But you're right. It does jump out that in winning it in 58. I wonder how much of it was to do with what he did with Northern Ireland. I mean, I know it was before the World Cup itself, but it would have been after they qualified. So, apart from him, no doubt playing very well for Spurs, you're right. It was before Spurs were hitting the heights. So maybe it was to a degree what he was doing for Northern Ireland, as well as for Tottenham.
It's odd, isn't it? Because he actually has a triumphant World Cup in 58. We think that the trophy must have been handed out before the World Cup, probably on the eve of the cup final, so well before the World Cup. He has a triumphant World Cup. Ireland go to the quarterfinal, or Northern Ireland. He's selected for the FIFA All-Star team at this World Cup. It's a very odd conundrum, really, to explain why exactly they went for Danny Blanchflower. Now we're coming towards the end. Sid Owen wins it in 59. Yeah. Sid Owen it's a maverick choice, really. We've had all those footballing aristocrats like Tom Finney and Nat Lofthouse and Billy Wright and Stanley Matthews, and then here comes Sid Owen. It's a bit difficult to understand quite what the motive was. Sid Owen was captain of Luton, and Luton reached the cup final. So again, I think we're looking at a bias towards the FA Cup in the selection of Footballer of the Year. He gets 3 England caps, but playing at centre half. He's centre half in the 7-1 defeat against Hungary in the spring of 54. You might think that if you're a centre half and you concede 7 goals, you probably aren't going to get picked again, but he does get picked again. He plays for England against Yugoslavia, 1-0 loss, and then against Belgium, first game of the 54 World Cup, which it ends up in a 4-4 draw. So 12 goals conceded in 3 games. And Sid doesn't get another go. Although I suspect he's one of those players who is absolutely heroic for his club. He may not make it as an England player, but he's absolutely heroic for his club. And in fact, the mere fact that Luton reached the FA Cup final, and by the way, he was also manager of Luton.
Yes, that's right.
I wonder if now you've mentioned Kenny Dalglish. I was trying to think, are there any other player managers who've taken their team to the FA Cup final and played on the occasion?
I think where we must be unique would be not just a player manager, but a captain manager.
Exactly that. Exactly.
Because Dalglish was a player manager in '86, but not the captain.
Very good. Very true. We ought to, of course, to add that for those who remember the 60s and 70s, that Sid Owen was head coach at Leeds United and was therefore party to that fantastic sequence of trophies that Leeds United, 2 First Division titles, 5 runners-up, 1 FA Cup, 1 League Cup, 2 Fairs Cups. That's a huge roster of that's an awful lot of silver to be polishing once a month.
I mean, would it be fair to say that perhaps in 1959, given that Luton had got to the cup final, he was the player manager, he'd been their captain throughout Luton's first spell in the First Division. Was it an excuse to give him an award for what he'd done through his career?
Yeah, well, now it's very interesting you say that, because I think a lot of these awards are for that. And one of the things that strikes me about that is that they are given to fairly elderly players. It's not elderly in football terms. That doesn't prevail in the 60s. In the 60s, they're quite willing to dish it out to a youngster like George Best. But in these years, I know. So I actually worked out the average age of a player to win Footballer of the Year in the 1940s and 1950s, and it's 32 basically. So you're talking there about. So I think that part of the reason why these were awarded was because they were for services rendered, if you like, not just across a season, but across a year. We're almost at the end. 1960 is Bill Slater. We don't remember Bill Slater at all, do we now? Who was he?
So again, he's an example of the difference in football in those days, because he got 20 caps for England amateurs and played in the cup final for Blackpool as an amateur, which again is an indication of how different football was in those days.
Last amateur to play in the cup final, apparently.
Right. So then he went to Wolves and became a professional there. And of course, Wolves we were talking about Billy Wright earlier, they were really top of the tree in the 1950s. So he had a very he had a very successful club playing career. He's somebody who seemed to have been a very adaptable player. He'd started off as a forward, but Wolves turned him more into a more defensive midfielder sort. Played for England. I think what apparently a game that was held up as one of his best performances was England played Brazil in 1958 in the group stages. A great Brazil side, and got a 0-0 draw.
Yes.
And Slater marked Brazil's playmaker, Didi.
Yes,
which he did a very good job there. So that's perhaps an indication that even though he isn't that well remembered, he certainly was a very effective player. He won 3 league titles for Wolves, which is no small matter. And then it seems as though he maybe broke the curse, because he, in 1960, won Player of the Year and then won the FA Cup.
At least we can end on that note of triumph, because most of our players seem to have been jinxed by the award. I did have a look at what positions were appropriate, what were characteristic for winning. We mentioned before there was only one outright centre forward in that lothouse.
Yes.
Here, the list is this: attack, defence, 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 attack, 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 goalkeeper, Troutman, of course, attack, midfield, defence, and midfield. So we've got really a bias towards defence, I would say, in that, and I think that's about right. It's it looks as if that sort of centre half around whom the team can be built is the kind of player who gets the Footballer of the Year in the 50s. And I did also turn my mind to which players from the 50s didn't win Footballer of the Year. And here are 5, like here are one or two characters that didn't win. Alf Ramsey never won it, which comes as a surprise. Jimmy Armfield never won it. Duncan Edwards never won it. He, perhaps above all, should have tasted that glory.
Yeah, Duncan Edwards. I mean, that's possibly one.